Psychologists have shown that people make these verbal switches.
It becomes like a real fundamentalist religion.
Organisms, when they realize they're being deceived.
It sounds like normal propaganda. One of the most important comments on deceit for the modern period, I think, was made by Adam Smith, who is greatly revered but very little read. He pointed out that a major goal of business is to deceive and oppress the public for good reasons. And one of the striking features of the modern period is the institutionalization of that process, so that we now have huge industries devoted to deceiving the public, and they're very conscious about it. Public relations industry, which strikingly developed in the freest countries, and for good reasons. Developed in Britain and the United States at the time, roughly the First World War, when it was recognized that enough freedom had been won, so you really can't control people by force, and you have to carry out modes of deception and manipulation in order to keep them under control. And by now, these are huge industries. They not only dominate marketing of commodities, which is maybe the sixth of GDP or something, just marketing, but by now they also control the political system. So, as anyone knows who watches a U.S. election, it's marketing commodities by same techniques that are used for marketing toothpaste. As far as self-deceit is concerned, it seems to me that's throughout history been mostly the property, the vocation of the educated classes, who tend, not 100% of course, but tend to be supportive of power systems, and that involves a lot of self-deceit. You have to reconstruct a picture of the world and in order to be conducive to the interests and concerns of the educated classes. Actually, I just went through an hour of that with a video conference overseas with students in the university. I mentioned where they want to talk about globalization. I started by saying there's two senses of globalization. I said every term of political discourse virtually has two senses. There's a literal sense and a sense that's used for doctrinal warfare, propaganda. So it's through terrorism, aggression, take a choice. This happens to be globalization. So I said, well, there's two senses of globalization. There's the doctrinal sense, which refers to the specific form of economic international integration that's organized by major corporations, a few powerful states, within the framework of the so-called Washington Consensus, World Trade Organization, and so on. That's one form. There's another, in the literal sense of globalization, just means international integration. And there's a huge number of people dedicated to globalization. They're called anti-globalization. So if you take a look symbolically at the World Economic Forum and the World Social Forum, which meet almost simultaneously, World Economic Forum represents a tiny sector of highly privileged people. And their form of international integration is called globalization. World Social Forum draws from about as wide a range of people in the world as any organization ever has. I mean, all over the world, different walks of life, anything from peasants to professionals and so on. And their form of globalization is called anti-globalization, because it's working out plans directed to the interests of people. So I started off by that, but then every question used globalization in the technical sense, the propagandistic sense. That's self-deceit. And that's a large part of what I think education's about. So yeah, deceit is a technique of control on the part of the powerful when force is unavailable. And of course, even when force is available. But and self-deceit is a substantial part of the history of the educated classes, as far back as you go.
Let me ask you personally, just out of curiosity, you've devoted most of your intellectual life to, on the one hand, the deep structure of language, and on the other hand, is something that I just classify under deceit and self-deception. All of your analyses of, like the the absurd double standard in which the word terrorism is used. It's not terrorism to arm the Contras to attack women's collectives in Nicaragua, but it's terrorism to strap a bomb on yourself and blow up some people in a pizzeria, etc., etc. Is there any relationship in your own life, or do you see any connection between your linguistic work and your continued analysis of deceit and self-deception in society?
There's a kind of a loose connection, and I've occasionally spoken and written about it, but only when I'm asked to, because, I mean, the honest truth is that if I was an algebraic topologist, I could do the same political work.
Indeed.
It wouldn't have any connection to it. So I don't draw anything from what I know about language.
Right.
And people are constantly saying, well, you know, you linguists, you must be analyzing the language of deception. But no, I mean, analysis of the language of propaganda and so on is just common sense. You don't have to have any special knowledge about it.
No.
But there is a connection, and in fact, the connection was brought out in during the Enlightenment, in the early Romantic period. So take, say, figures like Rousseau, for example, or Wilhelm von Humboldt is the most extreme. He was one of the founders of classical liberalism, but he was also a leading linguist, and he drew some of the potential connections, all coming from a kind of Cartesian source, namely the idea that the core element of human beings, what in the Cartesian picture distinguishes humans from beast machines, you know, animals and machines. Mm-hmm. The core property is a kind of creative capacity that humans have and no beast or machine has, which, according for the Cartesians and their followers, was manifested most clearly in language. Mm-hmm. That is the capacity to do what you and I are now doing, just to, you know, produce new thoughts, new ideas. For the Cartesians, the core element of the human essence, you know. And for the following generation, I mean, say, through Rousseau, some of Rousseau's more egalitarian essays, von Humboldt and others, it was also became what Bakunin called an instinct for freedom. You know, just some core element in humans that seeks freedom, and any institutional structure that limits that freedom has to be challenged. That's actually a core principle of classical liberalism, and it found its way right into anarchism, which, in my view at least, is the inheritor of classical liberalism. Mm-hmm. Classical liberalism was sort of bricked against the shoals of capitalism and basically disappeared. But I think it's fair to regard the anarchist tradition as a descendant based on the principle that you have to challenge any form of authority and make it justify its legitimacy, because it is interfering with a core component of human nature, which manifests itself most explicitly in the use of language, but many other things. So in that sense, there's a kind of a loose connection, but it's not a deductive connection. I mean, you can't draw some conclusion from linguistics about political life or conversely.
Right.
Do you see any other connection?
Well, one of the great benefits of language is the fact that we can make statements about events that are far in space and time. Of course, the problem is that we can make false statements about events distant in space and time. They're even harder to verify or check on than statements about events that are nearby. So language, to me, greatly increases the opportunity for deception in our lineage, misinformation, and it greatly increases the opportunities for self-deception as well. Do you think it matters much when you think about the leaders, like, let us say, the present set of organisms that launched this dreadful Iraq misadventure? When you're thinking about things like that, how important to you is it their level of self-deception? We know they launched the whole thing in a swarm of lies. The evidence for that's too overwhelming to even need to be referred to now. My view is that the deception entrains self-deception very easily.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure they launched it with lies.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's perfectly possible that they believed it.
Yes.
It's, I mean, in fact, if you look, we don't have a detailed record, but from the record we have, it looks as if they were kind of cherry picking. They had a goal,
Yes.
you know, and then they sort of cherry picked intelligence and coerced intelligence
Yes.
to yield evidence that would contribute to that goal.
Yes.
And anything that conflicted with it just was tossed out. Or in fact, the people were tossed out, like the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right. Indeed. Indeed.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's self-deception. I mean, it's very easy to. I think we all know it from personal life. You see it with young children.
Yeah.
You see two kids, fighting about a toy, let's say, and the older one takes the toy from the younger one, and his mother comes in and starts berating him. They give you an answer saying, "Look, it was really mine, and he took it from me, and he didn't want it anyway." And they build up a whole story, which the kid probably believes. They're not, and it's. I suspect it's pretty similar when Cheney and Rumsfeld pick the evidence they want to invade another country.
Yeah.
I suspect it's more or less the same mechanisms.
So
yeah, sure, it is self-deception, but it just it's so automatic that it takes effort and energy to try to see yourself from a distance.
Yes.
It's hard to do.
No, it is. I think in everyday life we're aware of the fact that when we're watching something on stage, so to speak, we have a better view, overall view, than the actors on the stage have. If you can see events laterally and sideways, you can say, my God, they're doing this and they're doing that. But if you're embedded in that network at the time,
it's very hard.
Much harder.
In fact, you can see it very clearly by just comparing historical events which are similar. They're never identical, but similar. So say take the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, the Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Just take those three. Well, from the point of view of the people who perpetrated it, it was a noble effort and done for the benefit of everyone. No reason to think they were lying. They had arguments. In fact, the self-justifications are kind of similar. Actually, I had an interview with a Polish reporter a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this, and I asked him whether he'd been reading Pravda during the during the Afghan war. Mm-hmm. We didn't have to go on with the conversation. He just laughed because he saw the point right away. I mean, it was about the same as the U.S. British press in regard to the Iraq war. There was criticism of the war in the Russian Soviet press, same kind that there is here. It's costing too many lives. Poor brave soldiers dying in vain. We can't bring the gifts we want to bring to the Afghan people. We can't bring because of terrorists who are, stop jihadi, Islamic crazed terrorists who are trying to disrupt people's lives. And we're improving things in Kabul. Women can go to the university, but how can we do this with the terrorists around? And on and on. It almost translates, but we can't see it for ourselves. We can see it for them. Like nobody doubts that the Russians committed aggression, that Saddam Hussein committed aggression. We attribute to them rational goals. Maybe they wanted to control the energy of the Middle East or something. With regard to ourselves, it's impossible. Which I've reviewed a lot of the scholarly literature and journalistic literature on this, and it's close to universal. We just cannot adopt towards ourselves the same sane attitudes that we adopt easily, in fact reflexively, when others commit crimes. It's like your terrorism example. Just can't do it. And if anyone says it, educated people, liberal intellectuals are infuriated because it suggests that we could do something that's not noble. We can make mistakes. That's easy. So you can criticize mistakes. You can criticize low-level crimes, like Abu Ghraib. You can criticize that. You can criticize My Lai, but not the educated, civilized people, the kind of people we have dinner with, see at concerts, sitting in air-conditioned offices, planning mass murder. So that's beyond criticism. On the other hand, if it's half-crazed GIs in the field, uneducated, don't know who's going to shoot at them next, yeah, you can blame them, and you can say, look how awful they are. And it's the same. Abu Ghraib is the same. You can criticize Lady England, disadvantaged young woman, very different from us. But how about the guys who organized and planned it?
Let me ask you a somewhat different question, which you've also written a lot about and thought a lot about. The economic motive is often hidden from discussion and from view. So, in retrospect, all of this hysteria about anti-communism, what was it? I mean, whenever someone came up with a socialist system, it was a system that was not going to be open to our exploitation. Likewise, in the Iraq case, there was an economic motive in terms of seizing a major section of the world and implanting some military bases. I feel that we plan to put those military bases in for good. We've never left any place voluntarily, except Grenada, right?
Well, after all, that's the nutmeg capital of the world. Giving
Right.
that up is quite a lot.
It's quite a lot, right. And Vietnam, they ushered us out the front door. So that was the end of that. But we haven't left the Philippines. We haven't left Cuba. We haven't left nowhere, So it's almost like we looked around the globe and saw there's this weight. There's this really important area with all this oil.
Even when this issue comes up, well, what about the oil? The scholarship discounts it, and they discount it for interesting reasons. They discount it because it doesn't make sense. After all, the U.S. could get hold of the oil anyway, because it's just on the market. Once a ship's on the seas, it goes anywhere you want. So it doesn't increase access to oil, which is perfectly correct. It doesn't increase access to oil. It increases control over oil. And that distinction is critical, and it just can't enter scholarship. In fact, here's another case like Afghanistan and Kuwait. Dick Cheney the other day, he was somewhere in Central Asia, Kazakhstan or somewhere.
Right.
He was trying to get them to make sure to direct their pipelines to the west so the U.S. can control them. And he said control over pipelines these are tools for intimidation and coercion. He was talking about if somebody else controls the pipelines.
Right.
So like if China controls the pipelines, it's a tool of intimidation and coercion. But if we control the pipelines, it's just benevolent and free and wonderful.
Yeah.
And I was interested to see if anybody's going to comment on that. I mean, here he is in whatever it was, Kazakhstan, to get them to ensure that we control the pipelines. But as long as he's talking about somebody else's control, then it's intimidation and coercion. When at the very moment he's trying to get them to give us control, that's liberation and freedom. Now, to be able to live with those contradictions in your mind really does take a good education.
But let me give you an example of the kind of stuff on the individual psychology studies that is reminded to me by points you're making. This we-they distinction and problems we have coming up with a consistent one. Psychologists have shown that people make these verbal switches when you're in a we-they situation. It's sometimes quite arbitrarily formed groups, but in any case, your group versus another group. So
groups that are simply set up for the experiment, you mean?
It can be,
yeah.
Or you can be talking about them and their group versus someone that's not a member of their group. But you can also do it experimentally, and I don't know that. I haven't studied that work yet carefully to see how long you have to set them up in these arbitrary groups to get this kind of thing going. But you have the following kinds of verbal things that people do, apparently quite unconsciously. If you're a member of my group and you do something good, I make a general statement about Noam Chomsky is an excellent person. Now, if you do something bad, I give a particular statement, Noam Chomsky stepped on my toe. But it's exactly reversed if you're not a member of my group. If you're not a member of my group and you do something good, I say, Noam Chomsky gave me directions to MIT. But if he steps on my toe, I say he's a lousy organism or he's an inconsiderate person. So we generalize positively to ourselves particularize negative and reverse it when we're talking about other people.
It sounds like normal propaganda.
Yes.
So Islamo-fascists or the Irish are all crooks.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Generalize the negative characteristic in the other, so to speak. So I'm trying to understand these phenomena at the individual level and then also put them together in groups. There are some times in which institutions act like individuals in that they practice internal self-deception. This was Feynman's famous analysis of NASA and the Challenger disaster. I don't know if you ever read the analysis. Well, it was beautiful. He said, when we decided to go to the moon in the 60s, there was no disagreement in the society, for better or worse. Everybody said, let's beat the Soviets to the moon. And the thing was built rationally from the ground up, and by God, before the decade was out, we were on the moon and back safely. Now then you had a $5 billion bureaucracy with nothing to do. So now you had to come up with rationales for what they did. So they did two things. They first of all decided on manned flight because it's more expensive. Secondly, they decided on the reusable, whatever you call it, thing, which turned out to be more expensive than if you had just had a new capsule every time. But you always have to sell this thing as making sense. Then you ended up with this absolutely hokey thing where we're going to do experiments in space on whether plants grow up or down when there's no gravity. Nonsense like that. Stuff that you can recreate in the lab at a trivial cost, as you know. So he then argued that NASA, the upper levels, were busy selling this pile of you-know-what to the general public. They didn't want to hear anything negative from the people down below. This was his analysis for how they came up with this O-ring nonsense. And they had a safety unit that was supposed to be involved in safety, but ended up being subverted in function just to rationalize non-safety. And the classic example is there were 24 flights, I think it was 24, prior to the disaster, and of those, 7 of them, there was O-ring damage. In one of those flights...
Detected,
yes. In one of them, the O-ring had been burned through a third of the way through. Then they came up with real absurdities. They said we've built in a 3-fold safety factor. That's to say that, you know, it only burned a third of the way through. But that, as you know, is a perversion of language. By law, you are required to build elevators with an 11-fold safety factor, which means you pack it full of people, run it up and down, there's no damage to your equipment. Now you make it 11 times as strong. You know, not it's afraid, 11th of the way through or whatnot.
And all of this data was available.
All of it was available. And it's like, it has an analogy to individual self-deception. The information is often somewhere in the organism. It's just well hidden. It's well down in the unconscious. It's well inaccessible. You've built up firewalls against it, etc., etc.
Are there any animal analogs to anything?
Well, I don't know. I believe that self-deception has evolved in 2 situations, at least, in other creatures. And I believe it could be studied, and I've suggested a way to do it, but nobody's done it. When you are making an evaluation of another animal in a combat situation, let's say male-male conflict, the other organism's sense of self-confidence is a relevant factor in your evaluation.
And that's shown by its behavior, you mean?
Yes, exactly.
So,
and so you
gorilla beating it, thumping its chest. Like that.
Yes, and suppressing signs of fear and not giving away, so forth. So you can imagine selection for overconfidence, selection for suppressing...
For showing overconfidence, even if it's not real. You mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Likewise in situations of courtship, where females are evaluating males. And again, the organism's sense of self is a relevant parameter. We all know that people that have a low opinion of themselves, that's a sexual and romantic turnoff right there. So again, you can have selection without language, it seems to me, for biased kinds of information flow within the organism to keep up a false front.
That's not necessarily... It may be that the animal that's putting up a false front knows it's a false front.
Indeed, but it may benefit from not knowing it.
Yeah.
It may act more...
Because it's easier to do it.
Easier to do it and perhaps more convincing because you're not giving away evidence.
Secondary signs.
Exactly, secondary signs.
Is there any evidence about this, or it's just speculation?
What you heard is rank speculation.
Can it be investigated?
I do not know of anybody who's doing it on self-deception. There's excellent work being done on deception in other creatures. To give you just one line of work there that is of some interest. Repeatedly, what we find now in wasps, in birds, and in monkeys, that organisms, when they realize they're being deceived, get pissed off, forgive my English. They often attack the deceiver, but especially if the deceiver is over-representing him or herself. If you're underrepresenting and showing yourself as having less dominance than you really have or whatnot,
They don't.
no, you're not. And the ones that attack you are precisely those whose dominant status you are attempting to expropriate or mimic. It's very interesting, and it suggests some of the dynamic in which, in which fear of being detected while deceiving can be a secondary signal, precisely because if you are detected, you may get your butt kicked, or you may get chased out.
There's even a name for that in the international affairs literature. It's called maintaining credibility.
So
you have to carry out violent acts to maintain credibility, even if the issue is insignificant.
Right. And that's a rationale for...
It's kind of like the mafia.
Yeah, indeed. And I know, I've heard that rationale used for obviously odious stuff. Well, we're maintaining credibility, otherwise we ain't got no street cred.
That's right. That's a common theme.
There was a brilliant study, which is a very difficult one to do at the time. You can do it much more easily now, by Gore and Sackheim about 20 years ago, using the fact that we respond to hearing our own voice with greater arousal than we show when we hear another human's voice. In both cases, we show physiological arousal. Galvanic skin response is one such measure. About twice as big a jump if you hear your own voice. Now, what you can do is have people matched for age and sex read the same boring paragraph from Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. Chop it up into 2, 4, 6, 12-second segments. Create a master tape where some of the time you're hearing your own voice, a lot of the time you're hearing not. Now then you've got to press a button which says if you think it's yours, and they also had them press a second button how sure you are. But meanwhile they got the galvanic skin response. Now they discovered two interesting things. First of all, some people denied their own voice some of the time, but the skin always had it right. Some projected their own voice some of the time, the skin always had it right. The deniers denied the denial, but the projectors half the time were willing to admit afterwards that they think they made the mistake of projection.
In a follow-up.
Yes, in a follow-up interview. Right. Just asking them. Okay, now the second thing they should...
What do you think the reason for that is?
The difference between the projectors and the deniers?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a good way of putting it, Noam, but to me, when you want to deny reality, you've got to act quickly and get it out of sight. The deniers also showed the highest levels of galvanic skin response to all stimuli. It's like they were primed to do it. Inventing reality, a little bit more a relaxed enterprise, but I haven't...
It's not as threatening.
Yes, something like that. I haven't thought out a good way to put it, but something along that is the way I've been thinking. The final thing they showed was that they could manipulate it. So, psychologists have lots of devices for making you feel bad about yourself, and one of them is just give you an exam. After all, these are university students. Just a little pseudo-exam. Give them their results at random. So they tell half of them you did lousy, half of them you did good. And then what they found was that those that were made to feel bad about themselves started to deny their own voice more, while those that are feeling good start hearing themselves talking when they're not. So, we didn't evolve to hear our voice on a tape recorder. You have to use some kind interpretation here, but it's like self-presentation is contracting under failure and it's expanding under...
You might be interested in a book that's coming out by a very smart guy, James Peck, who's a sinologist, who's got a book coming out called Washington's China, in which he does a very in-depth analysis of the national security culture. He went through the National Security Council literature, you know, the background literature and so on. And he does a kind of both an analysis of the content, but also a psychological analysis. And it was reminding me of it the whole time we were talking. I mean, what he shows are elaborate techniques of self-deception to try to build up a framework in which we can justify things like, say, overthrowing the government of Guatemala on the basis of some noble objective.
Right.
And it's done by making everything, as Dean Acheson once said, you have to make it clearer than truth.
Right.
And as this picture gets internally created and built up on by each group of national security staffers, it becomes like a real fundamentalist religion.
Yes.
Showing, you know, extraordinary self-deceit.
Yeah.
And then you end up with the Cheney's and the Rumsfelds.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I've been appalled when I pass a newsstand and there's some article there, News and World Report, China, the next threat. You know, like now we got to mobilize all our energy against China, and they're talking military.
And it's interesting because the threat of China is not military.
Exactly.
The threat of China is they can't be intimidated. It's very similar to what you're describing. Europe you can intimidate. So, for example, when the U.S. tries to get people to stop investing in Iran, European companies pull out. China disregards it.
Right.
I mean, and you look at the history, you understand why. They've been around for 4,000 years. They have contempt for the barbarians. They just don't give a damn.
Right.
Okay, you scream, we'll go ahead and take over a big piece of Saudi oil, you know, or Iranian oil. Or develop and that's the threat. You can't intimidate them. Well, and it's driving people in Washington berserk. But, you know, of all the major powers, they're the one that has been least aggressive militarily. They haven't even developed an offensive military capacity. I think they've got 20 missiles or something.
Right.
You know, nothing.
Yet we're talking about it already.
But we're talking about, and you can see what the threat is. They cannot be intimidated.
That's
and
what very important.
They just go ahead and they look at you with contempt. It's a little bit like, you know, a gorilla pounding his chest.
Some people lie about this, that, and the other. Other people lie about one another. Everybody lies a little sometimes.
Deceit and self-deception. All of your analyses of, like the absurd double standard in which the word terrorism is used. It's not terrorism to arm the Contras to attack women's collectives in Nicaragua, but it's terrorism to strap a bomb on yourself and blow up some people in a pizzeria, etc., etc. Is there any relationship in your own life, or do you see any connection between your linguistic work and your continued analysis of deceit and self-deception in society?
There's a kind of a loose connection, and I've occasionally spoken and written about it, but only when I'm asked to, because, I mean, the honest truth is that if I was an algebraic topologist, I'd do the same political work.
Indeed.
It wouldn't have any connection to it. So I don't draw anything from what I know about language.
Right.
And people are constantly saying, well, you know, you linguists, you must be analyzing the language of deception. But no, I mean, analysis of the language of propaganda and so on is just common sense. You don't have to have any special knowledge about it.
No.
But there is a connection, and in fact, the connection was brought out in with a video conference overseas with students in the university. I mentioned where they want to talk about globalization. I started by saying there's two senses of globalization. I said every term of political discourse virtually has two senses. There's a literal sense and a sense that's used for doctrinal warfare, propaganda. So it's true of terrorism, aggression, take your choice. This happens to be globalization. So I said, well, there's two senses of globalization. There's the doctrinal sense, which refers to the specific form of economic international integration that's organized by major corporations, a few powerful states, within the framework of the so-called Washington Consensus, World Trade Organization, and so on. That's one form. There's another, in the literal sense of globalization, just means international integration. And there's a huge number of people dedicated to globalization. They're called anti-globalization. So if you take a look symbolically at the World Economic Forum and the World Social Forum, which meet almost simultaneously, World Economic Forum represents a tiny sector of highly privileged people. And their form of international integration is called globalization. World Social Forum draws from about as wide a range of people in the world as any organization ever has. I mean, all over the world, different walks of life, anything from peasants to professionals and so on. And their form of globalization is called anti-globalization because it's working out plans directed to the interests of people. So I started off by that, but then every question used globalization in the technical sense, the propagandistic sense. That's self-deceit. And that's a large part of what I think education's about. So yeah, deceit is a technique of control on the part of the powerful when force is unavailable. And of course, even when force is available. And self-deceit is a substantial part of the history of the educated classes, as far back as you go.
Let me ask you personally, just out of curiosity, you've devoted most of your intellectual life to, on the one hand, the deep structure of language, and on the other hand, is something that I just classify under...
Enough freedom has been won, so you really can't control people by force, and you have to carry out modes of deception and manipulation in order to keep them under control. And by now, these are huge industries. I mean, they not only dominate marketing of commodities, which is maybe the sixth of GDP or something, just marketing. But by now they also control the political system. So, as anyone knows who watches the U.S. election, it's marketing commodities by same techniques that are used for marketing toothpaste. As far as self-deceit is concerned, it seems to me that's throughout history been mostly the property, the vocation of the educated classes, who tend, not 100% of course, but tend to be supportive of power systems, and that involves a lot of self-deceit. You have to reconstruct a picture of the world in order to be conducive to the interests and concerns of the educated classes. Actually, I just went through an hour of that.
Psychologists have shown that people make these verbal switches.
It becomes like a real fundamentalist religion.
Organisms, when they realize they're being deceived...
It sounds like normal propaganda. One of the most important comments on deceit for the modern period, I think, was made by Adam Smith, who is greatly revered but very little read. He pointed out that a major goal of business is to deceive and oppress the public for good reasons. And one of the striking features of the modern period is the institutionalization of that process, so that we now have huge industries devoted to deceiving the public, and they're very conscious about it, public relations industry, which strikingly developed in the freest countries, and for good reasons. Developed in Britain and the United States at the time, roughly the First World War, when it was recognized that